The station shuddered as the first wave of Kethtar boarding pods struck its hull, their molecular drills beginning to burn through layers of advanced metal that had been designed to withstand meteor impacts and energy weapon strikes. Emergency. Alarms wailed throughout the complex, their sound mixing with the deeper vibrations of the station's defensive systems coming online. In the council chamber, delegates from 12 species found themselves witnessing something that no diplomatic protocol had ever anticipated. Maya Harper and the Vrex war speaker stood side by side in the center of the chamber, no longer combatants, but partners in an improvised defense that was rewriting the rules of interspecies cooperation in real time. The contrast between them was stark, the small human diplomat and the massive reptilian warrior. Yet their coordination was already beginning to show an efficiency that surprised even themselves. "The Kethtar will target the power core first," the war speaker said, his tactical knowledge coming into immediate play. "They want to disable the station's shields and weapons before launching their main assault. If we can predict their entry points, we can set up defensive positions that will maximize our advantages." Mia nodded, her mind already racing through the implications and possibilities. "The council chamber has multiple access routes, but the main corridor is the most defensible position. We can funnel them into a killing zone, where their numbers become a disadvantage rather than an asset." The watching delegates began to understand that they were observing something unprecedented in galactic history. Never before had representatives from two different species collaborated so seamlessly during a crisis, especially not species that had been engaged in formal combat moments before. The transition from conflict to cooperation was so smooth that it seemed to defy everything that xenopsychologists understood about interspecies relations. Captain Ryan Brooks and his security team were already moving to establish defensive positions, but they found themselves taking direction from both Mia and the war speaker, as the two unlikely allies began coordinating a defense that combined human tactical flexibility with Vrex combat experience. The result was a strategy that neither species could have developed alone. "The human thinks in 3 dimensions, observed the war speaker, as he watched Mia analyze the chamber's architecture. "She sees possibilities that traditional tactics do not consider. We can use the chamber's ceremonial features as defensive advantages." The council chamber had been designed for diplomacy, not warfare, but Mia was already identifying ways to turn ceremonial elements into tactical assets. The raised platforms where delegates sat could provide elevated firing positions. The decorative barriers between sections could channel enemy movement into predictable patterns. Even the chamber's acoustic design could be used to create confusion among attackers while maintaining communication between defenders. Judge Prime Zeltharian watched in fascination as the two former combatants worked together with an efficiency that seemed to transcend their obvious differences. "This cooperation is unprecedented," he harmonized to his fellow delegates. "They are demonstrating integration capabilities that our models suggest should require years of cultural exchange to develop." The first Kethtar raiders broke through the outer hull and began moving through the station's corridors like a virus spreading through a bloodstream. Their approach was brutal and direct, relying on overwhelming force and speed to achieve their objectives before organized resistance could form. What they had not anticipated was facing defenders who combined multiple species' tactical advantages into a unified strategy. The battle began when the first group of raiders reached the council chamber's main entrance. They expected to find terrified diplomats cowering behind inadequate security forces, easy prey for experienced pirates who had raided dozens of similar facilities. Instead, they found themselves facing a coordinated defense that seemed to anticipate their every move. Mia's voice carried clearly through the chamber as she directed the human security forces, her calm tone contrasting sharply with the chaos of battle. "Remember, we are not trying to destroy them. We are trying to demonstrate something. Show them that cooperation is stronger than conflict." The distinction was crucial. The raiders expected violence to be met with violence, aggression to be answered with aggression. What they encountered instead was a defensive strategy that emphasized containment over destruction, capture over killing. The human forces used non-lethal weapons and restraint techniques that neutralized attackers without causing permanent harm. Meanwhile, the war speaker commanded his people's natural combat abilities with precision that turned the chamber into a maze of controlled violence. But his approach was also tempered by Mia's influence, focused on protection rather than destruction. The combination was devastatingly effective against raiders who had never faced such a coordinated and disciplined response. Dr. Helen Martinez watched in amazement as the battle unfolded according to principles that seemed to come from outside normal military doctrine. "They are not just fighting together," she whispered to her colleagues. "They are creating something new, a combat philosophy that emphasizes protection over domination." The raiders found themselves trapped in a web of defensive positions that seemed to adapt to their every move. When they tried to use their superior numbers, they found themselves channeled into narrow corridors where their advantage was neutralized. When they attempted to use their weapons' superior firepower, they discovered that their targets had vanished into defensive positions that had not existed moments before. But the most unnerving aspect of the defense was its restraint. Raiders, who expected to die in battle, found themselves captured instead. Pirates who had spent their lives believing that strength meant the ability to kill discovered that their opponents possessed the far greater strength of knowing when not to kill. The final group of raiders reached the council chamber itself, breaking through the main entrance with weapons blazing and death in their hearts. They expected to find the chamber's defenders weakened and demoralized by the prolonged battle. Instead, they found Mia Harper and the war speaker standing together in the center of the chamber, surrounded by their successful defense, waiting calmly for the last act of this unexpected drama. "Surrender," Mia called to the raiders, her voice carrying across the chamber with absolute authority. "You are outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and outclassed. But you are not beyond redemption. Choose cooperation over conflict and live to make better choices." The lead raider, a scarred veteran of 100 battles, stared at the scene before him in disbelief. His entire worldview had been built on the assumption that strength meant the ability to take what you wanted from those too weak to stop you. What he was seeing challenged everything he thought he knew about how intelligent beings interacted with each other. The war speaker stepped forward, his massive form radiating controlled power. "I am Vrex," he said simply. "I was bred for war, trained for combat, designed to kill. Yet I stand here beside this human not as her enemy, but as her ally. If I can choose cooperation over conflict, so can you." The moment stretched between predator and prey, between old assumptions and new possibilities, between the galaxy as it had always been and the galaxy as it might become. The war speaker's question hung in the air between them, demanding an answer that would define not just Mia's personal philosophy, but humanity's place in the galactic community. Before she could respond, however, the arena's energy barriers began to flicker and pulse with warning colors. Emergency signals echoed through the chamber as the station's defensive systems detected something approaching from the void beyond. "Alert status Gamma," announced the station's artificial intelligence, its synthesized voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "Unknown vessels approaching at high velocity. Configuration suggests hostile intent. All delegates should prepare for emergency protocols." The timing could not have been worse. In the middle of humanity's most critical diplomatic moment, with Mia standing in an arena face-to-face with a Vrex warrior, while demonstrating the deepest principles of human nature, external forces were threatening to derail everything that had been accomplished. Through the arena's transparent ceiling, points of light became visible against the starfield, growing larger as they approached the council station. The ships were sleek and predatory in design, clearly built for warfare rather than exploration or trade. Their approach vector and speed suggested they were not here for peaceful contact with the Galactic Council. "Kethtar raiders," hissed one of the Vrex delegates, recognizing the ship configurations. They must have learned about the council session. A station full of delegates from 12 species would represent the greatest prize they could imagine. The Kethtar were pirates and slavers who operated in the space between civilized systems, preying on merchant vessels and isolated colonies. They were not part of the Galactic Council and had no interest in peaceful coexistence with other species. Their appearance during humanity's evaluation was either incredibly bad timing or incredibly bad luck. The war speaker's head snapped up as he processed the implications of the situation. His warrior instincts immediately focused on the external threat, but he found himself caught between his duty to defend the station and his ongoing combat with the human representative. The ancient protocols that governed trial by combat were clear that once begun, such contest could only end with victory, defeat, or mutual agreement to suspend hostilities. The combat must be concluded, he said, his voice carrying undertones of frustration and conflict. I cannot abandon this arena while the trial remains unfinished, yet my duty as a warrior demands that I help defend the station against these raiders. Mia looked up at the approaching ships, her mind racing through possibilities and implications. The Kethtar attack represented more than just a physical threat to the delegates. If the council session was disrupted by violence, if blood was spilled in the chamber where humanity was supposed to prove its worthiness for peaceful coexistence, the psychological impact could destroy any chance for membership, regardless of how the combat trial ended. But it also represented an opportunity to demonstrate something that no amount of prepared speeches or cultural presentations could show. Real crisis had a way of revealing true character, stripping away pretense and exposing the fundamental nature that lay beneath diplomatic politeness and careful preparation. The trial does not need to be abandoned, Mia said, her voice carrying a certainty that surprised even herself. It needs to be expanded. You asked what humans fight to protect. Let me show you. What happened next would be talked about in council chambers for generations to come. Instead of asking for the combat to be suspended, instead of seeking shelter or evacuation like any rational being faced with overwhelming odds, Mia Harper began moving toward the arena's edge, where the energy barriers met the chamber's main floor. The barriers can be lowered from inside the arena, she called to the watching delegates, but only if both combatants agree to end the formal trial. War Speaker, I offer you a choice. We can continue our personal combat while raiders threaten everyone in this station, or we can show the council what humans and Vrex can accomplish when we work together. The proposal was so audacious that several delegates began making sounds of disbelief and alarm. The idea of releasing two combatants from a formal arena during an external attack violated every security protocol in the Galactic Charter. It also created possibilities that no one had considered when the ancient combat laws were written. The war speaker stared at Mia for a long moment, his reptilian features showing the complex calculations running through his mind. Everything in his training told him that combat trials were sacred, that abandoning such a contest brought dishonor that could never be erased. But everything in his nature as a defender of his people told him that greater threats demanded greater responses. You would trust me, he said slowly, to fight beside you rather than against you, even knowing that I challenged your species' worth, even after I sought to prove your inadequacy through violence? Mia's smile carried warmth that somehow managed to reach across the vast evolutionary distance between their species. Trust is what humans do, she said simply. We trust that intelligence can overcome instinct, that understanding can bridge any gap, that cooperation can achieve what conflict never could. Will you help me show the council what that looks like? The war speaker's decision came not as words but as action. His massive clawed hand reached for the arena's control panel, entering the code sequence that would lower the energy barriers and release both combatants from the formal constraints of trial by combat. The barriers dissolved like morning mist, leaving Mia and the war speaker standing together on the chamber floor, while emergency lights bathed everything in urgent red illumination. Citizens of the council, Mia called out, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's acoustic systems. You wanted to see what humanity brings to the galactic community. War Speaker, your people value strength and honor above all else. Let us show these raiders what happens when human adaptability meets Vrex warrior skill. The first explosions began echoing through the station's hull as the Kethtar ships opened fire, their weapons seeking to cripple the station's defenses before launching boarding parties. In the council chamber, delegates from 12 species watched in amazement as a human diplomat and a Vrex warrior began working together to coordinate a defense that neither could have managed alone. Lieutenant Grace Turner realized that she was witnessing the birth of something entirely new and galactic. politics, not just an alliance between species, but a demonstration that cooperation could emerge from conflict, that understanding could grow from confrontation, that the greatest strength lay not in the ability to dominate others but in the wisdom to work with them. The real test of humanity's worthiness was about to begin, and it would be measured not in words or presentations, but in actions taken under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. The moment stretched between them like a bridge across an infinite chasm, connecting two beings from worlds so different they might as well have been from separate universes. The war speaker's massive form trembled with contained energy, every instinct screaming at him to complete the combat ritual that had defined his existence since birth. Yet something in Mia's calm presence held him motionless, caught between the violence he understood and something else that he was only beginning to glimpse. Around the arena, the watching delegates began to understand that they were witnessing something far more significant than a simple combat trial. The ethereal collective, beings of pure energy who rarely concerned themselves with physical conflicts, suddenly harmonized in frequencies that had not been heard in their species for millennia. Their translation came through as wonder mixed with something approaching reverence. She demonstrates mercy when she possesses the power to destroy, the ethereal voices whispered in unison, their energy forms pulsing with colors that had no names in any physical language. She teaches when she could dominate. She offers understanding when she could demand submission. This is not combat. This is art. The observation was more profound than it might have seemed. The ethereal collective had existed for millions of years, long enough to witness the rise and fall of countless civilizations. They had seen every form of intelligence that the galaxy had produced, studied every approach to conflict resolution and social development. What they were observing in the arena was something genuinely new, an approach to strength and power that challenged fundamental assumptions about how intelligent species interacted with each other. Mia's hand remained on the war speaker's arm, a gesture so simple yet so revolutionary that it was causing tremors of uncertainty throughout the chamber. Physical contact between species during formal combat was not just unprecedented, it was considered impossible by most diplomatic theorists. The biological, cultural, and psychological barriers between alien species were supposed to make such intimate connection inconceivable. The war speaker looked down at the small human hand resting on his scarred hide, studying it as if it were an artifact from a lost civilization. Her skin was pale and soft compared to his armored scales, yet there was strength in that touch that went beyond anything physical. It was the strength of absolute confidence, of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and why they were doing it. "I do not understand," he said, his harsh voice softer than it had been since the combat began. "You could have struck killing blows. I observed at least 7 opportunities where you possessed clear tactical advantage. Your nerve strikes were precise enough to cause permanent paralysis if you had chosen different pressure points. Why do you show mercy to an enemy who would show you none?" The question hung in the arena air like incense, heavy with implications that went far beyond personal combat philosophy. Every delegate in the chamber was asking themselves the same thing. In a galaxy where strength determined survival and compassion was often seen as weakness, Mia's behavior seemed to contradict everything that evolutionary theory suggested about intelligent life. Mia smiled, her expression carrying warmth that somehow managed to cross species barriers and reach even the most alien observers. "Because you are not my enemy," she said simply. "You are someone who needed to understand what humanity really represents. We are not violent because we enjoy destruction. We are capable of violence because sometimes it becomes necessary to protect what we love. But we are also capable of choosing when not to use that violence even when we could." The distinction was subtle but critical. Most species viewed violence and restraint as opposite ends of a spectrum, where greater capacity for one meant lesser capacity for the other. What Mia was demonstrating was something different, a philosophy where the ability to destroy and the wisdom not to destroy were complementary rather than contradictory traits. Lieutenant Grace Turner, the human communications officer, felt her understanding of her own species shift as she watched the scene unfold. Turner had spent her career studying interspecies communication, trying to find ways to bridge the gaps between vastly different forms of intelligence. What Mia was accomplishing went beyond anything in the textbooks, creating connection where theory said none should be possible. She's not just demonstrating human values, Turner whispered to her colleagues. She's proving that those values can work across species barriers. She's showing that empathy and understanding are not just human traits, but universal possibilities. The war speaker's breathing had steadied, his aggressive posture gradually relaxing as he processed what he was experiencing. For his entire life he had been taught that strength meant the ability to dominate others, that respect could only be earned through victory in combat. The human was offering him a completely different definition of strength, one based on the courage to be vulnerable and the wisdom to seek understanding rather than dominance. This is impossible according to standard xenopsychological models, observed Dr. Krintar, the Zeltharian behavioral analyst. His harmonic voice carried undertones of scientific excitement, mixed with professional confusion. Interspecies empathy of this depth should not be achievable without extensive cultural exchange and adaptation periods. The human is creating emotional resonance across barriers that our models suggest should be impermeable. The chamber's atmosphere had changed from the bloodthirsty anticipation of violence to something approaching scholarly fascination. Delegates who had come expecting to witness a brief and brutal demonstration of human inadequacy were instead observing what might have been the most significant advancement in interspecies relations in galactic history. The war speaker took a step backward, not in retreat, but in reassessment. His claws retracted slowly, the deadly weapons disappearing into sheaths of flesh and bone. For the first time since entering the arena, he was not positioned for immediate attack. The change was subtle but significant, representing a fundamental shift in how he was approaching the encounter. "You speak of protection," he said, his voice carrying new undertones that the translators struggled to render accurately. "What is it that humans love enough to fight for? What drives your species to develop such capacity for violence while maintaining such restraint in its application?" The question opened doorways that led to the heart of human nature itself. Mia's answer would need to encompass not just individual psychology, but the entire sweep of human history, the complex interplay of cooperation and conflict that had shaped her species' development. She was being asked to explain what it meant to be human to beings who had evolved under completely different circumstances and pressures. But before she could respond, something unexpected happened that would change the entire dynamic of the encounter and challenge every assumption that both combatants had brought into the arena. The war speaker's third attack came with the force of a meteor strike, his massive claws creating sparks as they scraped against the arena floor where Mia had been standing milliseconds before. His frustration was becoming visible in the way, his muscles tensed and his breathing grew heavier. This was not how combat was supposed to work. He possessed every advantage that evolution and training could provide, yet somehow the small human continued to slip away from his attacks like smoke in the wind. Mia's movements had settled into a rhythm that seemed to match the heartbeat of the station itself. She flowed from position to position with an economy of motion that wasted no energy and left no openings for counterattack. Each step was precisely calculated, each turn perfectly timed. She was not running from the war speaker so much as leading him through a complex dance where he thought he was the aggressor, but was actually following her lead. The watching delegates were beginning to see patterns in her movement that went beyond mere evasion. The crystalline observers, whose mathematical minds could process thousands of calculations per second, started to recognize the geometric precision in Mia's positioning. She was not moving randomly, but following invisible lines of force that maximized her efficiency while minimizing the war speaker's advantages. "Fascinating," chimed the lead crystalline delegate, his harmonic voice carrying overtones of scientific curiosity. "The human appears to be applying principles of fluid dynamics to bipedal combat. She is treating the arena as a three-dimensional space where momentum and angular velocity can be redirected rather than simply absorbed or avoided." The war speaker's attacks were becoming wilder, less controlled. Each failed assault made him angrier, and anger made him sloppy. He was falling into the oldest trap in combat, allowing emotion to override training and instinct. His claws swept, through empty air again and again, creating dangerous openings that a more aggressive opponent could have exploited. But Mia was not interested in exploitation. She was teaching a different kind of lesson. Dr. Helen Martinez watched in amazement as Mia began to incorporate elements of the arena itself into her strategy. The energy barriers that contained the combat area were not solid walls, but force fields that could be used to redirect momentum. When the war speaker charged at her, Mia would position herself so that his attack would carry him into one of these barriers, using the rebound effect to further disorient him. "She's not just using human fighting techniques," Martinez whispered to her colleagues. "She's adapting alien technology to human combat philosophy. She's turning the entire arena into a weapon." The concept was revolutionary in ways that most species could never understand. Humans did not just adapt to their environment. They actively modified it to suit their needs. They built tools, created strategies, found ways to turn disadvantages into advantages through creative thinking and lateral problem solving. What Mia was demonstrating was not just individual skill, but the fundamental human approach to existence itself. Engineer Carlos Rodriguez, part of the human technical team, found himself analyzing Mia's movements from a completely different perspective. She was treating the combat as an engineering problem, using physics and geometry to overcome what should have been insurmountable odds. Every movement served multiple purposes. Every position offered several possible escape routes. Every action created opportunities for future actions. The war speaker paused in his attacks, breathing heavily as he tried to understand what was happening. In hundreds of combat encounters, he had never faced an opponent who fought this way. Most species relied on their natural advantages, using strength against strength or speed against speed. The human was doing something completely different, something that challenged every assumption he had about how intelligent beings approached conflict. "You mock me," he snarled, his translated voice carrying undertones of wounded pride. "You dance around like a child playing games while I offer you honorable combat. Do you think this makes you superior? Do you believe that avoidance is the same as victory?" Mia paused in her movements, standing completely still for the first time since the combat began. The sudden stillness was more unnerving than her constant motion had been, creating a moment of perfect tension that made every delegate lean forward in anticipation. "I do not mock you," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the arena. "I respect you enough to show you something that your species has never seen before." The war speaker's confusion was evident in his posture. Respect was not something he associated with the kind of combat he had been experiencing. In Vrex culture, respect was shown through direct confrontation, through meeting strength with strength and proving worthiness through superior skill, or power. What the human was doing seemed more like elaborate humiliation than respectful combat. "Then show me," he demanded, raising his claws in a gesture that was both challenge and invitation. "Stop running and face me properly. Prove that your species deserves to stand among the stars." What happened next changed everything the Galactic Council thought they knew about humanity. Mia moved forward, not away from the war speaker, but directly toward him. Her approach was neither aggressive nor defensive, but something entirely different, something that transcended the traditional categories of combat behavior. She walked calmly and deliberately, making no attempt to protect herself or prepare for violence, trusting completely in something that the war speaker could not understand. The war speaker's instincts screamed at him to attack, to take advantage of this apparent vulnerability. But something in Mia's manner stopped him. There was no fear in her approach, no desperation or resignation. Instead, there was a kind of certainty that made him hesitate despite every warrior instinct he possessed. When Mia reached striking distance, she did something that no combat manual in the galaxy could have predicted. She placed her hand gently on the war speaker's massive arm, not to strike or grapple but simply to make contact. The touch was so unexpected, so contrary to every rule of combat engagement, that the war speaker found himself frozen in place. "You want to see human strength," Mia said, her voice soft but carrying to every corner of the chamber. "This is it. Not the ability to destroy, but the wisdom to choose when not to destroy. Not the power to defeat enemies, but the courage to turn enemies into allies." The war speaker stared down at her, his reptilian features showing confusion and something that might have been the beginning of understanding. For the first time in his life, he was facing an opponent who was not trying to defeat him, but to communicate with him. The concept was so alien to his experience that he had no framework for processing it. Dr. Jennifer Smith, the human cultural attaché, felt tears streaming down her face as she watched the scene unfold. "She's not trying to win," Smith whispered in sudden understanding. "She's trying to teach. She's showing them what it means to be human." The lesson was just beginning, and its implications would reshape the Galactic Council's understanding of intelligence, strength, and civilization itself. The combat arena materialized around them like a dream becoming reality, its boundaries marked by walls of pure energy that hummed with contained power. The circular platform was perhaps 30 feet across, large enough for movement, but small, enough that neither combatant could avoid the other for long. Above them, the chamber's ceiling had become transparent, revealing the vast star field beyond the station. It was as if they were fighting in space itself, surrounded by the infinite darkness that separated worlds and species. The Vrex war speaker began his ritual preparations, movements that had been passed down through generations of warriors. He extended his claws to their full length, testing each one for sharpness and flexibility. His muscles rippled beneath his scarred hide as he performed stretching exercises, designed to prepare his body for the violence to come. Every movement spoke of deadly efficiency, of a being that had been created for the sole purpose of combat, and had spent his entire life perfecting that purpose. The other council members watched from their protected observation areas, many of them placing bets on how quickly the small human female would fall. The crystalline delegates were offering odds of 30 seconds or less, while the more optimistic aquatic representatives were giving Mia a full minute before the war speaker's claws found their mark. Even the ethereal collective, normally above such crude displays of emotion, pulsed with anticipation that bordered on bloodthirst. Mia stood quietly in her corner of the arena, making no aggressive gestures or threatening displays. She had removed her diplomatic jacket and shoes, leaving her in a simple gray jumpsuit that offered no protection against claws or fangs. Her feet were bare against the arena floor, giving her better grip and sensitivity to movement. She appeared completely vulnerable, defenseless against a predator that could have torn her apart with minimal effort. "This seems rather unfair," said Kethamara, the lead aquatic delegate, her translated voice carrying undertones of concern. "Perhaps we should reconsider the terms of this challenge. The physical disparity between the combatants is extreme. This will be less a test of skill than a simple execution." The war speaker turned his massive head toward the observation area, his reptilian features twisted into what might have been a smile. "Fairness is a concept for the weak," he rasped. "In combat, there is only survival or death. If the human is too frail for proper combat, then her species is too frail for galactic citizenship." "Fairness," Mia replied, her voice carrying clearly across the arena despite its conversational tone, "is a very human concept. We have learned to make the unfair fair." She began to move, not in the aggressive patterns that the war speaker expected, but in fluid motions that seemed almost dance-like. Her movements appeared random and purposeless, lacking any recognizable combat stance or defensive posture. The war speaker watched her with growing confusion. In his experience, all sentient species approach combat in similar ways. They adopted defensive positions, they displayed their weapons, they attempted to intimidate their opponents with shows of strength or aggression. What the human was doing made no sense according to any military doctrine he had ever studied. Dr. Helen Martinez, watching from the human delegation area, suddenly understood what she was seeing. Her xenobiology training had included extensive study of human movement and biology, and she recognized patterns in Mia's motions that went far beyond simple combat preparation. "She's not fighting like a warrior," Martinez whispered to her colleagues. "She's fighting like a human." The distinction was important in ways that most species could never understand. Humans had not evolved as apex predators like the Vrex. They were persistence hunters, tool users, creatures that survive through intelligence and adaptability rather than raw physical power. Human combat techniques had developed along completely different lines than those of naturally aggressive species, focusing on efficiency and precision rather than brute force. Admiral Parker had trained Mia in an ancient human art that combined elements of dance, meditation, and martial philosophy. It was a discipline that emphasized flow over force, adaptation over aggression, understanding over domination. The goal was not to defeat an opponent through superior strength, but to become like water, flowing around obstacles and finding the path of least resistance. The war speaker's patience finally exhausted itself. With a roar that shook the arena walls, he lunged forward with lightning speed, his claws extended to their full length, capable of piercing human flesh like tissue paper. His massive form moved with surprising grace for something so large, covering the distance between them in a single bound that should have ended the fight before it truly began. But Mia was not there when he arrived. She had moved at the last possible second, not away from the attack but alongside it, using the war speaker's own momentum to carry him past her. As he flew by, her hand found a specific point on his neck, a pressure location that she had studied from captured Vrek's anatomical records. The touch was brief and seemingly gentle, but it sent a shock of paralysis through the warrior's nervous system that caused him to stumble and crash into the arena wall. The war speaker rolled to his feet with admirable speed, but his movements were slightly uncoordinated. The nerve strike had not caused permanent damage, but it had disrupted his balance and timing in ways that would affect his combat effectiveness. He turned to face Mia again, his reptilian eyes narrowing with a mixture of surprise and respect. "Impossible," he hissed. "No species fights this way. You have no enhanced reflexes, no natural weapons, no armor plating. How did you move with such precision?" Mia resumed her strange dance, never standing still, never presenting a solid target. "Because I am doing what humans do best," she replied, her voice calm despite the deadly situation. "We adapt, we learn, we find ways to turn our weaknesses into strengths." The watching delegates were beginning to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented. Combat in galactic civilization typically followed predictable patterns based on each species' evolutionary advantages. The strong overpowered the weak, the fast outmaneuvered the slow, the well-armed defeated the defenseless. What was happening in the arena violated every assumption about how intelligent beings fought each other. Colonel Ben Williams, the human military attaché, smiled grimly as he watched Mia continue her fluid movements around the increasingly frustrated war speaker. "She's not just adapting to him," Williams said to his colleagues. "She's making him adapt to her. That's the difference between humans and everyone else in this galaxy. We don't just survive in our environment. We make our environment work for us." The war speaker launched another attack, this time trying to corner Mia against the arena wall, where her mobility would be limited. But again she seemed to flow around his assault like liquid, her movements so smooth and natural that they appeared effortless. She was not fighting the Vrek's warrior so much as dancing with him, leading him through a complex choreography that he did not understand but could not resist. Each time the war speaker attacked, Mia's response was different. She never used the same evasion twice, never repeated a movement or pattern. It was as if she was learning from each exchange, cataloging his techniques and developing counters in real time. The war speaker, despite his superior physical abilities, found himself falling behind in a contest that was becoming more mental than physical. The arena had become a classroom, and Mia Harper was teaching a lesson that would change how the Galactic Council viewed humanity forever. Mia had prepared for scientific demonstrations that would showcase humanity's understanding of quantum mechanics and stellar engineering. She had rehearsed cultural presentations that would highlight human art, music, and literature. She had memorized diplomatic speeches that addressed every concern the Council had raised about human membership. What she had not prepared for was the sudden scraping of claws against metal, as the Vrek's war speaker rose from his delegation area like a nightmare given flesh and form. The war speaker stood nearly 9 feet tall, his reptilian body covered in scales that had been scarred by countless battles. Each scar told a story of survival, of violence overcome through superior strength and skill. His claws, each longer than a human finger, gleamed in the chamber's artificial light as he stepped away from his delegation area and onto the main floor. The other Vrex delegates remained seated, but their body language suggested they had known this moment was coming and approved of their war speaker's decision. "Words mean nothing," the war speaker said, his voice a harsh rasp that the translators struggled to convert into something resembling human speech. The sound was like metal scraping against stone, aggressive and threatening in ways that transcended language barriers. "Your species claims to have evolved beyond primitive violence, yet your history is written in blood. You speak of peace, while your homeworld still echoes with the sounds of warfare. You present art while your people build weapons capable of destroying entire planets." The chamber erupted in surprise sounds that varied wildly between species. The Zeltharians produced harmonic tones that suggested shock and concern, while the aquatic delegates created bubbling sounds that their translators rendered as expressions of disbelief. The crystalline observers chimed like broken bells, and even the usually silent ethereal collective began to pulse with agitated energy that made the air itself feel charged with tension. The war speaker continued speaking, his words cutting through the noise like a blade through silk. "I have studied human military history. I have watched recordings of your wars, analyzed your strategies, examined your weapons. You are a species that has turned violence into an art form, that has elevated destruction to a science. You claim to seek peace, but your every instinct is toward conflict and dominance." Captain Ryan Brooks, head of security for the human delegation, immediately stepped forward. His hand moved instinctively toward his sidearm before he remembered where he was, and forced himself to stop. Brooks was a veteran of 3 colonial conflicts and had faced down everything from pirates to alien raiders, but he had never encountered a situation quite like this one. The diplomatic protocols for council meetings strictly forbade violence, but the war speaker seemed to be operating under different rules. "I challenge the human to prove their worth in the ancient way," the war speaker continued, his scarred hide rippling with barely contained aggression. "Not through words or presentations or carefully prepared speeches, but through trial by combat. Let us see if humanity's representative can back up her species' claims with action. Let us discover whether humans are truly as evolved as they pretend to be, or whether they are still the savage creatures their history suggests." The challenge hung in the air like a poison cloud, contaminating everything it touched. This was not supposed to happen. The council had specific procedures for evaluating new species, careful protocols designed to prevent exactly this kind of situation. Combat trials were ancient relics from the early days of galactic civilization, used only by the most primitive species and generally considered barbaric by modern standards. Dr. Peter Johnson, the mission psychologist, started to protest. He had spent years studying Vrex culture and knew that combat challenges were deeply ingrained in their social structure, but he had never imagined that one would be issued during a formal council meeting. The psychological implications were staggering. If Mia accepted the challenge, she would be fighting a being literally bred for warfare. If she refused, humanity would appear weak and cowardly in the eyes of species that still valued physical prowess. "The ancient protocols have not been invoked in over 2 centuries, Judge Prime Zeltharian said, his harmonic voice carrying undertones of concern and confusion. "Such challenges are considered obsolete by modern diplomatic standards. Surely, we can resolve this matter through more civilized means." But the war speaker was not interested in civilized solutions. His species had ruled through strength for thousands of years, and despite their membership in the Galactic Council, they still believed that true worth could only be proven through combat. "The ancient laws remain valid," he insisted. "Any species seeking membership may be challenged by any existing member. The human may refuse, of course, but such refusal would demonstrate the cowardice that lurks beneath their pretense of evolution." Mia felt the eyes of every delegate in the chamber focused on her. The moment stretched like a wire under tension, threatening to snap and send consequences ricocheting in all directions. She could feel the weight of her delegation's expectations, the hopes of billions of humans back on Earth, the careful diplomatic work of years threatening to collapse under the pressure of this unexpected challenge. Her adoptive father, Admiral Steve Parker, had trained her for moments like this, though he had never expected her to face them alone and light years from home. Parker was a decorated veteran who had risen through the ranks not because he was the best fighter, but because he understood that true strength came from knowing when to fight and when to find another way. He had taught Mia that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act correctly despite being afraid. "I accept," Mia said simply, her voice clear and steady despite the chaos erupting around her. The words hit the chamber like a thunderclap. Her entire delegation froze in shock, unable to believe what they had just heard. Dr. Lisa Chen dropped her translator device, the sound of it hitting the floor echoing through the sudden silence. Commander Jake Martinez felt his heart stop beating, for a moment before resuming at twice its normal rate. Captain Brooks started to move toward the platform, but Mia raised her hand in a gesture that stopped him in his tracks. "You cannot be serious," Dr. Johnson said, his voice cracking with stress. "Mia, you have no training for this kind of combat. The war speaker is a professional soldier with decades of experience. This is suicide." But Mia was already removing her diplomatic jacket, revealing the simple jumpsuit underneath. She had no weapons, no armor, no apparent advantages against a being that had been genetically enhanced for combat over thousands of generations. The war speaker was not just larger and stronger than any human could ever hope to be. He was also faster, more durable, and equipped with natural weapons that could tear through human flesh like paper. "This is madness," whispered Dr. Helen Martinez, the xenobiologist who had studied Vrex physiology for years. She knew better than anyone what Mia was facing, understood the physical capabilities of a species that had evolved on a high-gravity world, where only the strongest survived. The average Vrex warrior could bench press a small vehicle and run fast enough to catch a speeding car. Their claws could cut through steel, and their hide was tough enough to stop small-caliber bullets. Yet something in Mia's calm demeanor suggested that she knew exactly what she was doing. She began to stretch her shoulders and arms, moving with a fluid grace that seemed almost dance-like. Her movements were economical and precise, suggesting training that went far beyond simple diplomatic preparation. The war speaker watched her with growing confusion, unable to understand why his opponent seemed so relaxed in the face of certain death. The chamber's systems began to reconfigure themselves, ancient protocols activating for the first time in centuries. The floor started to glow and reshape itself, creating a circular arena that would contain the combat while protecting the watching delegates. Energy barriers sprang up around the fighting area, their surfaces shimmering like heat, mirages in the artificial light. Admiral Parker had indeed trained Mia for moments like this, but not in the way that anyone might have expected. The massive doors of the Galactic Council chamber opened with a soft hiss that echoed through the vast space, like a whisper of destiny. Mia Harper stepped through the entrance and felt the weight of 6 billion human souls pressing down on her shoulders. The chamber stretched before her like a cathedral built for gods, its ceiling disappearing into darkness, while streams of starlight filtered through crystal panels in the walls. She had dreamed of this moment for 3 years, practiced her speeches until every word was perfect, but now that she stood here, everything felt different than she had imagined. The chamber was arranged in a perfect circle with 12 distinct sections, each designed to accommodate the unique needs of the species that ruled this part of the galaxy. The Zeltharian section featured towering spires of living crystal that hummed with soft melodies, while the Vrex area was built from dark metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The aquatic delegates floated in transparent tubes filled with their homeworld's purple-tinted water, and the ethereal collective existed as shifting clouds of energy contained within fields of pure force. Ambassador Mia Harper had been chosen for this moment when she was only 25 years old, selected from among thousands of candidates not because she was the smartest or strongest, but because she possessed something that testing could never measure. The selection committee had called it an indefinable quality that made people want to listen to her, to trust her, to believe that whatever she said might actually be true. Now at 28, she carried the hopes and fears of an entire species. As she walked across the polished floor toward the central platform, where she would make humanity's final case for membership in the galactic community. Commander Jake Martinez watched from the human delegation area, his weathered hands gripping the railing so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. He had fought in the colony wars, had seen the worst that humanity could do to itself, and yet he believed with every fiber of his being that his species deserved a place among the stars. Beside him, Dr. Lisa Chen adjusted her translation device. For the 100th time, her nervous energy evident in the way she kept checking and rechecking equipment that she knew was working perfectly. The translator was a marvel of human engineering, capable of converting not just words but emotional undertones and cultural context between species that had evolved on worlds so different they might as well have been different universes. The human delegation had spent 3 years preparing for this day, learning about each council species, understanding their cultures, their fears, their hopes for the future. They had presented evidence of human achievement in science, art, philosophy, and technology. They had shown recordings of human music that moved even species without ears to tears, demonstrated mathematical theorems that solved problems the Council had been working on for centuries, and shared stories of human compassion that transcended the barriers between worlds. Yet despite all of this, questions remained about whether humanity could be trusted with the vast responsibilities that came with galactic citizenship. The Zeltharian Judge Prime rose from his crystal throne, his insectoid form towering 12 feet above the chamber floor. His multiple eyes, each the size of a human fist, focused on Mia with an intensity that would have made a lesser person falter. When he spoke, his voice was a harmony of tones that the translators rendered into words, but something of the original beauty was lost in the conversion. The sound was like listening to a symphony through a broken radio, beautiful but incomplete. "Human Mia Harper," the Judge Prime said, each word carrying the weight of absolute authority. "Your species has presented evidence of technological capability that exceeds minimum standards for council membership. Your artistic achievements demonstrate a level of creative thought that suggests advanced cognitive development. Your social progress indicates a capacity for growth and adaptation that we find encouraging. Yet questions remain about humanity's fundamental nature, about your species' tendency toward what our observers have termed volatility." Mia felt, her heart beating faster, but she kept her expression calm and focused. She had expected this moment, had prepared for it, but hearing the words spoken aloud made them feel more real and more dangerous. The volatility question had haunted humanity's application from the beginning, a polite way of referring to humanity's history of violence, war, and destruction. Every species had their dark periods, but human history seemed to be written in blood and fire in a way that made the Council nervous about granting them access to technologies that could threaten entire worlds. "You have one final opportunity," the Judge Prime continued, his harmonic voice filling every corner of the vast chamber, "to demonstrate why humans deserve membership in our Confederation of Worlds. This is your last chance to prove that your species has evolved beyond the primitive impulses that have marked your past, that you can be trusted to work alongside other intelligent life forms for the betterment of all." The chamber fell into absolute silence, broken only by the soft humming of life support systems and the distant whisper of cosmic radiation filtered through the station's shields. 12 species, representing billions of sentient beings across hundreds of worlds, waited to hear what humanity's final advocate would say. The responsibility was enormous, the stakes higher than anything in human history. But Mia felt a strange sense of calm settling over her as she prepared to speak. She thought about the journey that had brought her here, about the years of preparation, and the countless people who had worked to make this moment possible. She thought about the children on Earth who would grow up either among the stars or trapped forever on their small blue world, depending on what happened in the next few hours. She thought about her adoptive father, Admiral Steve Parker, who had trained her not just in diplomacy and politics but in the fundamental values that made humanity worth saving. But most of all, she thought about what it truly meant to be human, about the contradictions and complexities that made her species, both beautiful and terrible, both inspiring and frustrating. Humans were capable of incredible cruelty and incredible kindness, sometimes within the same individual, sometimes within the same day. They could create music that moved souls across species barriers and weapons that could destroy entire civilizations. They could love with a passion that transcended death and hate with an intensity that consumed everything in its path. Mia stepped onto the central platform, her footsteps echoing in the silence like heartbeats. The platform began to glow with soft light, lifting her several feet above the chamber floor so that every delegate could see her clearly. She looked around the circle of alien faces and forms, meeting as many eyes as she could identify, trying to connect with each species on whatever level was possible. Some looked curious, others skeptical, a few openly hostile. All of them were waiting to see what humanity's representative would do with this final chance. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, but Mia Harper had been preparing for this her entire life. Everything that had happened before, every choice that had led her to this chamber, had been building toward this single moment when the future of humanity would be decided by her words and actions. She took a deep breath, feeling the artificial atmosphere of the station fill her lungs and prepared to speak for her entire species. The lead raider's weapon trembled in his hands as he stared at the impossible scene before him. Everything his experience had taught him about galactic civilization suggested that different species fought each other, that cooperation was temporary, at best, and usually based on mutual fear rather than mutual respect. What he was witnessing challenged the fundamental assumptions that had guided his entire life as a predator in the spaces between worlds. Behind him, his fellow raiders were beginning to lower their weapons as the reality of their situation became clear. They were not just outnumbered and outgunned. They were facing something they had never encountered before, a form of opposition that offered strength through unity rather than dominance through violence. The concept was so alien to their experience that they had no framework for processing it. "This is not possible," the lead raider said, his voice carrying undertones of confusion and something that might have been fear. "Species do not work together this way. You should be fighting each other, not standing united against us. We studied your council records. We know about your conflicts and competitions." Mia stepped forward, her movement calm and deliberate despite the weapon still pointed in her direction. "You studied our history," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "But you did not understand our future. Yes, we have conflicts and competitions. Yes, we disagree and argue and sometimes fight. But when faced with a common threat, when protecting something greater than ourselves, we find ways to work together that transcend our differences." The war speaker nodded, his massive head moving slowly as he processed the implications of what had just occurred. "I challenge the human to prove her species' worth through combat," he said, addressing not just the raiders but the entire council chamber. Instead, she proved something far more valuable. She demonstrated that strength is not the ability to defeat enemies, but the wisdom to turn enemies into allies. Judge Prime Zeltharian rose from his crystal throne, his multiple eyes focusing on the scene with an intensity that made the air itself seem to vibrate. When he spoke, his harmonic voice carried overtones of amazement and something approaching reverence. "In 3 millennia of council history, we have never witnessed such a display. We have observed combat trials, diplomatic presentations, and cultural exchanges. But we have never seen transformation occur in real time." The other delegates began to murmur agreement, their various forms of communication creating a symphony of approval that filled the chamber with alien music. The crystalline observers chimed with mathematical precision, the aquatic delegates bubbled with liquid harmony, and even the usually silent ethereal collective pulsed with energy that painted aurora patterns across the chamber walls. "Human Mia Harper," the Judge Prime continued, "you faced a trial by combat and chose to turn it into a lesson in cooperation. You encountered an external threat and used it as an opportunity to demonstrate the values that define your species. You have shown us something that our models suggested was impossible: the seamless integration of different forms of intelligence in pursuit of a common goal." The lead raider slowly lowered his weapon, his scarred features showing the kind of confusion that comes from having fundamental beliefs challenged and found wanting. "What happens to us now?" he asked, his voice carrying undertones of resignation mixed with something that might have been hope. Mia looked at him with the same calm compassion she had shown the war speaker, her expression suggesting that even pirates and slavers were not beyond the possibility of redemption. "That depends on what you choose to do next," she said simply. "You can continue being what you have always been, or you can decide to become something better. The choice is yours, but the opportunity is real." The chamber fell silent as delegates from 12 species contemplated the implications of what they had witnessed. The human representative had not just passed their tests, she had redefined what the tests meant. She had shown that intelligence was not just the ability to solve problems, but the wisdom to transform problems into opportunities. Dr. Peter Johnson felt tears streaming down his face as he watched Mia walk back toward the human delegation area. As the mission psychologist, he had studied every aspect of human behavior and psychology, but what he had witnessed went beyond anything in the textbooks. Mia had not just represented humanity, she had elevated it to something greater than the sum of its parts. "The vote," announced Judge Prime Ziltharian, his harmonic voice carrying formal authority that made every delegate straighten in attention, "all in favor of granting full membership to the human species in the Galactic Council of Worlds." The response was immediate and overwhelming. Every delegate, representing every species, indicated approval through their various cultural methods. The Zeltharians harmonized in perfect pitch. The Vrex roared their approval. The crystalline observers chimed like celebration bells. And the ethereal collective blazed with light that filled the entire chamber with colors that had no names in any physical language. For the first time in Galactic Council history, a species had been accepted, not despite their capacity for violence, but because of their wisdom in restraining it. The vote was not just unanimous, it was enthusiastic, representing a recognition that humanity brought something unique and valuable to the galactic community. As Mia walked back to her delegation, she was enveloped in embraces from her team members who could barely contain their joy and pride. Commander Jake Martinez, the weathered veteran who had fought in humanity's darkest conflicts, found himself sobbing with relief and gratitude. Dr. Lisa Chen, who had spent 3 years preparing for this moment, could only repeat, "Impossible, impossible," while laughing through her tears. Admiral Steve Parker, the man who had raised Mia after her parents died in the colony wars, stepped forward with tears streaming down his face. "Your parents would be so proud," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "You did not just save humanity's future, you elevated it beyond anything we dared to hope for." Captain Ryan Brooks shook his head in amazement as he surveyed the chamber where his security team was already working with other species to process the captured raiders. "When I saw that combat challenge issued, I thought we were finished," he said to his colleagues. "I never imagined someone could turn a deathmatch into a diplomatic triumph that would change galactic civilization itself." Dr. Helen Martinez, still processing what she had witnessed from a scientific perspective, spoke for all of them when she said, "Mia, what you accomplished here was not just combat or diplomacy or even leadership. It was art in its purest form, the most beautiful and most human demonstration anyone could imagine." The war speaker approached the human delegation area, his massive form moving with a grace that spoke of newfound respect and understanding. "Human Mia Harper," he said, his harsh voice carrying undertones of genuine admiration. "I came here to test your species through strength. Instead, you taught me about strength I did not know existed. I request permission to serve as cultural liaison between our peoples to help others understand what I have learned today." As the celebrations continued and arrangements began for humanity's integration into galactic society, Mia looked out through the chamber's crystal panels at the starfield beyond. The same stars that had seemed so distant and forbidding when she first entered the chamber now appeared welcoming, full of possibilities and opportunities that had been earned through courage, wisdom, and the fundamental human belief that cooperation was stronger than conflict. She had delivered humanity's final performance on the greatest stage in the galaxy, demonstrating not just what humans could do, but what they could inspire others to become. Her family, both biological and chosen, could not have been prouder as they prepared to return to Earth with news that would transform human civilization forever. The stars were calling, and humanity was finally ready to answer with voices raised, not in conquest but in harmony with the vast choir of intelligence that filled the cosmos.